Good morning, everybody. This is Carrie Getz with Strategicom and another edition of our podcast series. Today, we're lucky enough to be interviewing Kevin Kent, who is with Critical Facilities Efficiency Solutions. Kevin has been in AFCOM with me for a long time. Most of his work is really around energy efficiency and making sure that data centers are good environmental stewards and looking at different things in the environmental stewardship space. So, Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Carrie. Very happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what got you into the whole energy efficiency thing and why you feel it's important, because it's a really kind of a different line of work or a different career from what we've talked about on this podcast to date, but I think it's one that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, so I've worked in data centers and been a data center ops manager for over 27 years. And really what got me interested in energy efficiency, I would say about 10, 12 years ago, I had gone to probably my fifth or sixth AFCOM data center world. And I seemed to always migrate towards power, cooling, and efficiency tracks. And I had set through so many sessions over the years and heard so many brilliant speakers about how you can reduce your energy cost and you can save money. And I'll be honest with you, I was so bored in the data center that I worked in at Ohio State. And bored is a good thing, right? If you're managing a data center and you're not bored, that means all kinds of things are probably going bad. And so being bored is good, but for my personality, it's not good. So really what I decided to do one year was I didn't believe everything that I was hearing on how to gain energy efficiency in your data center. So I set out to basically take a year. I'm going to do these certain things and I'm going to prove these folks wrong. And when I go back to data center world the following year, I'm going to have a sit down with them. But during that year's time, something really interesting happened is I was really proving the theories and the practices that I had been hearing about were actually very accurate. And to be honest, the certain techniques at that time that I was working on, the people that had introduced them at Data Center World, they were actually underselling the effectiveness that they could actually have. And it just kind of slowly evolved into that. I'm also very active with many environmental foundations within the U.S. and globally. And this past summer, I became a climate reality leader. It's the Climate Reality Project is run by former Vice President Al Gore. It was 3 days of pretty intense training with him and several other experts. So really the two worlds have kind of collided for me. And how that happened is I take a motorcycle trip with family every summer. We've gone all over North America, literally hundreds of thousands of miles. But during this 15-year stretch, some of the places every 3 or 4 years we would revisit, I really started to see and notice drastic changes, not only within the landscape, but within the environments that we would travel through. And one of those trips, it dawned on me that, hey, data centers globally have to be chewing up a lot of power, and they have to be producing a pretty large carbon footprint. And I started researching that. And along the way, I've met many brilliant minds like Professor Ian Bitterlin, Andrea, who do a lot of research and calculations on global data center usage. And what my instincts told me were exactly right. The global data center community, people can't really decide exactly how much we're using. Some people feel it's more or less. Others don't want to report it because they feel it's proprietary. And I understand that. The part of that frustrates me is there are some companies that view that as a means to, I'm not even going to worry about efficiency. We can't even figure out how much we're using, so why should that matter? But so what the stats tell us, and reputable groups like Uptime Institute, they'll routinely publish information on this, but we know globally that data centers are somewhere in the 420 to 480 billion kilowatt hours a year. We know that they are chewing up a lot of power. Even here in the U.S., while we look for our data centers to source and use clean energy, in Virginia, the Ashburn area is a huge problem with using power that's generated by burning of fossil fuels. And long story short, data centers do have a huge hand in our environmental impacts and the climate change that we have been seeing throughout the years. And I've really been putting forth great effort the last few years to not only create awareness, but provide education on how data center owners and managers can reduce their power consumption and reduce their carbon footprint. And it's turned into a consulting business for me that has gone incredibly well. I didn't foresee myself doing this 10 or 15 years ago, but I absolutely love what I do, and I love seeing that it's making a positive impact.
You bring up a really great point because we've talked about on this podcast before how there's sort of this holy trinity of data centers, right? Just like the three veggies that go in gumbo and pretty much every Cajun dish. But power, cooling, and compute are really the three things that everybody worries about in a data center. But when it comes to reporting power, first off, a lot of corporate data centers are sitting in a corporate office building on the same power meter as the building. So it makes really reporting that power accurately difficult because, you've got some AC to DC conversions that you miss, and really that's where a lot of your efficiency disappears. And then we have a lot of data centers moving into co-location facilities, and not all of the co-location facilities have really cared about power because it's a pass-through cost. And so when companies are looking to move into a data center or find a different data center, it really makes it difficult to figure out because none of those numbers are reported in the same way, really, from one facility to the next. So what prescriptively, let's talk about different data centers. So if somebody owns their own footprint, where's some sort of low-hanging fruit that they can look for, and what kind of training do you recommend that they look towards, to try to figure out some of those answers?
Yeah, so you make some great points about frustrations with reporting and understanding consumption. And the question you asked about, hey, I own my own data center, some of the low hanging fruit. Very interestingly, what I'm going to say, this applies to any and every data center, but specifically, if I own my own, I have to know. You mentioned the three areas. I have to know how much power I'm using. I have to know my available space, and I have to know what my cooling is. And the only way to know those is to be able to actively measure. And I think Lord Kelvin, many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, he said you cannot effectively manage what you do not measure. And there are so many data centers. To me, that's pretty basic. To be measuring and understanding not only what you're consuming, what your capacity is, and what you're currently using across both your mechanical and electrical environment. So you talked about a mixed facility. The data center I've managed at Ohio State for years, we have our entire IT department is in that facility. We have classrooms for nurses, all around the data center. And it took me almost a year and a half just to get a copy of the electric bill. And it took me almost that long to try and decipher and slice out what is actually ours and what are we actually consuming. The thing that really helped me was being able to go to someone outside of the medical center, specifically our service provider, and ask them, hey, can you give me some help in measuring, specifically hanging some meters on our HVAC equipment, helping me decipher the power factor and the efficiency losses through our UPS system, ATS switches, and generators. They were very happy to do that. They didn't charge or no costs were involved with that. And actually, when we started to measure and track what we were using, I found out they had an incentive program. And if we could show reductions of our kilowatt hours that our data center were using, we actually end up getting some really significant rebate money from them. So measuring and understanding what your need is and what you're actually consuming and then what your capacity are very important. So when we talk about measuring, everywhere I travel, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., is interesting. This is always met with varying levels of enthusiasm, but the standard that we use right now is power usage effectiveness. and it's been misused as a marketing tool
Beat to death and
for
underfed.
yes, and but here's the bottom line, Carrie. I know you know Mark Monroe really well. I had the great fortune 2 years ago to work through a leaders lab with him in Seattle on energy efficiencies within data centers, and he talked a lot about PUE. So here's the bottom line: where we are now, would a different or another metric, would it be more effective? I mean, I think it could be, but with PUE, I think we can all agree if you measure correctly, even if you're doing a level one PUE measurement, if you measure consistently and correctly, I think we can all agree the lower your PUE number is, the better off you are in your data center. But here's the important thing about PUE, or if there's some other way that you can measure. PUE not only one provides you with a baseline, but PUE is going to point you to where your ineffective uses of power are. And almost always we see those on the cooling side. And if I dig into global data center numbers, or even just in the US on cooling, we can see that this was produced by Uptime. They said roughly $1 billion for 12.5 billion kilowatt hours of wasted energy in US data centers in 2019. So when I hear people scoff at PUE and, oh, I think it's janky and it's used for marketing, if you use it correctly, and if all data centers were using that correctly, I don't think we would see 12.5 billion kilowatt hours of wasted energy in US data centers. And if we expand globally, that number goes up significantly in wasted kilowatt hours in cost, and more importantly, carbon footprint.
Well, you bring up a good point about, like we said, beat to death and underfed. That number has been historically not used well. And, some co-location facilities do that as a modeled number. Some do that as an average. Some do it as a snapshot in time, which is, I would say, pretty useless because your compute load varies drastically. And so, to your point, you can't, if you don't measure it, you don't know if it's whatever you're trying to fix is doing well. But we also have a problem in, trying to fix some of these solutions. And there's a lot of, because we've always done it that way, kind of terminology. So I'll give you a great example. Last week, I kid you not, I was on the phone with a guy that wanted to know, my husband is in commercial air conditioning. So he was talking to one of his end users and they went in the data center and it was, the guy said, no, we have to keep it at 65 degrees. And so my husband said, you really need to talk to my wife. So we got on the phone and started talking about, no, you really don't have to keep a data center at 65 degrees anymore. It's been proven that, the IT load can support, much better. But you also have the problem, back to the data centers are sitting in a corporate office building, or even some of the older colo facilities, that equipment hasn't fully depreciated yet. And there's still a lot of data centers that aren't in a hot aisle, cold aisle arrangement. There's still a lot of kind of just old, it's my way or the highway. I don't really care what the numbers say. And how do you recommend getting through to those guys? I mean, I know you do this as a part of your consulting, but isn't just a huge part of that just getting the word out and making people understand? And then also, because there is a sphere of influence here, right? So even if the data center guy knows, if he's got, and he knows that his equipment needs to be replaced and it hasn't been fully depreciated, there's a CFO saying, no, you can't do that. And if it supports the rest of the office building, then you're really toast. And so there are a couple solutions, which I'll get your opinion on in a minute, but what do you say offhand to that?
Oh, I say offhand, you brought up probably 3 hours worth of conversations, but it's really interesting because as I meet folks at conferences and through other data center owners and data center operations managers, the perception that I get when I talk with these folks is, yes, I understand about PUE and other ISOs, and then carry another big standard or guideline that I live by are the ASHRAE standards, and in TC99.
That's exactly what I sent him.
Yeah. So in TC99, a few years ago, they expanded they have their recommended range, and then they expanded the allowable range, both on temperatures and humidity. in data centers, and they class the equipment A1 being the oldest through A4. And I'll tell folks, we'll talk about this, we'll talk about PUE, and the perception I have is, hey, they understand this and they're probably managing their environment pretty well. And then you go into their data center, and it's just what you said. We have no containment going on. We have cold aisle and hot aisles actually facing each other, not separated. We see set points at temperatures well below what would be considered the uh, allowable range, and even some below the recommended range. And then the other thing that I see is rack density is growing, equipment is shrinking. I see this in colos, enterprise, and even some of the earlier hyperscales, although they cycle their equipment pretty quickly. But the footprints in data centers are shrinking. And I actually will go into data centers where they have 4 and 5 times more cooling that they're providing to the facility than what they need. So, as a data center operator, there's some things that I understand. 15 years ago, we had pretty good staffs, and we could divide up the work, and we could give attention to all the areas that we knew were important. But as the years have gone, our staffs have shrunk. Many data centers, especially enterprise, we're down to staffs of 1 and 2, where they used to be maybe 10 to 12. So our job, number one job, is we have to keep the facility up and running, and we have to do everything we can to avoid not only downtime, but any sort of latency. And what we will do as data center ops managers is we prioritize what is the most critical and important thing in this facility down to least important. And energy efficiency, honestly, and somewhat sad, it falls to the bottom, because me having my set points at 68 or supplying 3 or 4 times amount of supply air that I need, that's not going to cause me to lose my job. If I do things from the thermal side or from the environmental side that cause thermal issues and an outage or latency, that actually could cost me my job. So those of us who are managing facilities were aware of that, and we accept that as, hey, I can't get to that, and I'm going to keep my facility up and running, and I'm not going to lose my job, and maybe someday I can get to that. But the short answer is this: there are standards and guidelines and ways to measure data centers that, if they're followed with their intended use, they work incredibly well for you. And the ASHRAE guidelines, Mark Monroe, he had some wonderful thoughts and comments that we put in our white paper from the Seattle Leaders Lab. But in the facility I manage for Ohio State, people walk in that data center all the time. They're like, oh my gosh, it's so hot in here. And I said, yes, because we're only putting the supply air to the front of the servers where they need it. And there are so many things you can do that don't require capital expenditures that you can, I hate to say this term, but you can almost do for free, that will have such huge impacts on the environment. But we choose not to do them because of low staffing and fear that we could change an environment that's working flawlessly, cause an outage, and therefore lose our job.
If it ain't broke, don't break it.
Exactly.
But part of the thing that's been horribly ignored in this industry is that IT kit, for the most part, is self-healing. And I did a keynote at 7x24 a few years ago and told everybody in the room that they needed to quit looking at overly redundant facilities first, because in many cases, the IT is going to make up for that. So one server will fail over to another server and fail over to another server. But we've gotten to this sort of siloed thing in the industry because budgets are different, requirements are different, needs are different, and facilities is sort of operating under the we have to throw redundancy at everything. And IT is also operating under the we have to throw redundancy at everything. But if you have one application that's backed up in 5 different locations, all of those locations don't need redundancy.
Yeah, we are the masters in IT of figuring out things that could cause us an outage, and then designing and architecting ways that we can get around that. But I really like what you were saying about the redundancy, because this leads to something I see growing very quickly within the data center industry. And I'm talking about virtualization. So within the data center, we saw our servers become virtualized, and as far as redundancy and vMotion and how we can manage servers became so much more efficient, easier to do, smaller footprint, and it sort of revolutionized everything. And that rolled into the storage virtualization and the network virtualization. And really, if we look at the data center, there's one area left to be virtualized, and it's power. And Carrie, you and I had a conversation in San Francisco last summer about virtual power systems, software-defined data centers, and the steam for that is picking up big time. But what we see is owing to your point about redundancy, we'll go in a data center and you can go globally and you can easily find this, but there's such inefficient use of equipment, and it's creating unnecessary waste in the form of heat and cooling that we don't need, and then also cost. And what we see on a global average, 8 of almost every 10 servers are idling, but they're still consuming electricity. They're putting out heat, even when there's not jobs or anything happening with that equipment. And it ends up being a just large amount of waste. And what we're seeing through the digital technology and the virtualization of power is the ability to not only eliminate that waste, but to drive costs down so much lower and extend the useful life of equipment. But what happens with the power is the same thing we saw with virtualization of the equipment in the data center, but basically it's creating a layer of abstraction, and it makes it easier to match resources within the changing needs. And in the software-defined power, the resource is the electricity required to keep the electrical and mechanical equipment running. The reliability is improved by being able to shift applications to a data center, an area with the greatest amount of availability and or cost-efficient power at any given time. And I think the thing that has been such a big game changer with this is the advent of batteries that can do long-term energy storage. Natron and Jack Pouchette, who worked with Verda for years, is working with Natron. The batteries that they're developing and the way they can store power and how they're being integrated in software-defined or virtual power systems. It's a real game changer. And the redundancy and the waste that you highlighted, the software-defined power, virtual power systems, I think they're going to really revolutionize and help us really eliminate that unnecessary redundancy and waste that we see in almost every data center.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I would say, probably the coolest technology that I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, because it is the missing link. It ties that IT kit together with the power, and it does other things too. Like, if you're operating with a microgrid, say, you pick a medical center, since, you used to work at one, and suppose that there's a small data center on site for nuke med and other things that are very latency intolerant. And we put a 20, 40 cabinet data center on site in the parking lot with a small microgrid attached. You literally can move that load around. So maybe sometimes you're operating at the colo, sometimes you're operating on site over your microgrid when the peak costs are high. So there's an amazing, cost savings to be had there too. But it can also do things like it'll come through that data center and figure out if you have 10 cabinets that have IT load running on them, you can automatically have that set to move all of those idle servers off. And maybe you're only powering 6 cabinets now instead of 40 cabinets. So I think that it's an amazing technology, but that whole missing link between IT and facilities, and actually, it's kind of like when you wanted to go out when you were a kid, your mom said, ask your dad. Your dad said, ask your mom.
Right.
At some point, you got to get them in the same room and have them talk.
Yeah. It's interesting that you made the mention of a medical center. So I'm hoping in whatever remaining time I contract with Ohio State's Wexner Medical Center, that's one of the projects that I'm working very hard on. So in Ohio, we do get a decent amount of wind, not like Texas and some of the areas out west. And sun, we actually have less days of sun than we have days with sun. But a microgrid for that data center makes a lot of sense for us. And to be able to self-generate the power, and now have batteries that we can actually generate power, extra power on the days where the sun is shining, and we can store that and keep that for the days where it's not, and be able to power our facility. And then the hope is this: I see a lot of folks, businesses, and data centers that use microgrids, is that we'll generate enough power that we can even have power as a service that we can either give or sell back to different parts of the university or doctors' offices, and we can get very creative and efficient with how we manage the data center and the power. But the thing that becomes exciting about that is if you're self-generating, you're taking strain off the traditional grid, but more importantly, the energy that you're sourcing is from a clean source, and the reduction in carbon footprint just for the medical center alone would be in the hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon emissions that no longer would go into the atmosphere. So it's really exciting, but it's also really frustrating to work with various companies and state agencies and to understand and learn how difficult it is to try and source and use clean energy, or even self generate your power. That the political roadblocks that are out there, they're really, really difficult. And it's given me a better understanding of, if I owned a big data center, I would not want to go through that hassle. I would say, throw more coal on the furnace, send me how many ever megawatts of power I need, and let's go.
Well, a lot of the power companies now are providing grants for their end users to become either more energy efficient or do some of that cogen, like you were talking about, because they're running out of power. And
Yeah.
I don't think people realize, like, I saw a statistic on how much power is used just by sharing one photo with all of your friends. And it's pretty astronomical when you multiply that by the number of photos that are shared every day.
Yeah. One of the slides I love to use when I'm doing presentations, and this is not at all a knock on Google, it's actually a tribute to them, but I'll ask the question, hey, who has never done a Google search? And believe it or not, in one of the places in Africa that I was, there are a few people that had, and I'm like, you've never used a Google search? And they're like, no, we use Bing. I'm like, okay, so at least you're searching. But if you looked at how much power a single Google search uses, on average, it's 0.0003 kilowatt hours. You could power a 100-watt light bulb for maybe 10 seconds. And I mean, just it doesn't show that consumes a whole lot of power. But if you looked at all of the monthly Google searches and put them all together, you're now looking at 3.9 million kilowatt hours. 260,000 kilograms of CO2. And we could actually, with that amount of power, I could power one 100-watt light bulb for 4,534 years. That would be equivalent to over 600,000 miles worth of carbon emissions from driving. And as you say, we think something so simple as, hey Siri, how do I get to the grocery store? And you use a search on there. It's astronomical the amount of power that would use. And you're right. I don't think most people understand that. And that goes into the whole, hey, let's create some awareness of actually what we're using. And then let's provide some education on how we can get around that, or be more better stewards of the technology that we have, manage, and are using.
And I think, we've kind of come, you talked a little bit about how data centers are getting smaller with virtualization. I can remember maybe 15 years ago when the predictions were that, all data centers were going to be 30 kilowatts per cabinet, and we would run out of power in 5 years. And then virtualization came along and everybody took a deep breath and went, nice. But, to your point, we are doing smaller workloads. We're offloading workloads. So, you might have one company that has some stuff that's in the cloud, some stuff that's in a colo, some stuff that's on premise. Edge compute is certainly going to drive a lot of that compute out to smaller areas. And I think, if you look at the predictions for modular data centers and smaller footprint data centers, they're going through the roof between now and 2025. And the nice thing is, with the smaller building, you have a lot more control. and you're not trying, that's one of the problems with the older data centers is this big giant hall, and somebody now has 4 rows of cabinets in there as opposed to the big giant hall. And there's no way to be efficient in that space. Even with containment, you still have a chunk of room that's not doing what you need it to. And so don't you think we're going to kind of see a shift back to, at least for enterprise data centers, in more smaller autonomous buildings, especially as some of the chillers and the generators and the power distribution and all starts aging out?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're actually seeing that now. And it's funny when you talk about modular data centers, I just think of Hector Diaz automatically when you say that. I've gone to so many sessions and talked with him a great deal about that. But you brought up a point that it really piques my interest, where we look at these enterprise facilities that actually have pretty spectacular infrastructure, both mechanical, electrical, network wise, and maybe a little bit aging, but we see the density of our racks, not necessarily 30 kilowatts, but the footprint within the data centers has definitely significantly shrunk over the past 10, 15 years. But there are a few companies out there now that they actively look for enterprise data centers that are a third full, but still have all this capacity. And we see hyperscalers that are in that area very willing to lease that and use that almost as like some edge space where they can very cheaply put their equipment in. They know that they have the connectivity and everything that they would need to operate as somewhat like an edge facility. And then in turn, it helps out those enterprise areas where you're not wasting all of this space. And if you calculate, hey, what's the cost per square foot in this facility? It gets pretty astronomical. So we kind of see this recycling in this push to reuse and not waste the space and the mechanical and electrical and network that are already there. But I totally agree with what you're saying. I think this is a trend that we're going to see continue to grow. And it's very interesting because we can predict and we think we know how things are going to go, but the data center community, there are just so many brilliant minds that are out there, and it always takes this bend, like the virtualization or trying to reuse enterprise data space and make it useful again. It gets me really excited to wonder, hey, what's coming around the corner? How is this going to go? And it seems like we always pick a way that's very good, and it takes us down a decent path for a while, and it allows us, as you say, to catch our breath and figure out what's next.
Yeah, I think we're going to see lots of changes probably over the next 5 years because, for a long time, this industry has really tried to be more energy efficient, mostly from a cost savings perspective. So the environmental stewardship was just a happy byproduct of companies that were trying to save money on cooling and, other things because it's such a massive, massive bill. And being able to carve out some of that space and compute smarter, I think, is certainly a chunk of that. And people sort of lose sight that if you move your load to the cloud, it's still in a data center. It's still consuming energy. It's still part of that bill. You just don't see it every day. And there's going to be some right sizing, I think, that happens along the way. And you see these companies that are now moving out of the cloud because the cloud got to be so expensive. But I think realistically, the smartest way to handle any of these decisions is look at what the application needs and then work backwards, as opposed to what we've been doing kind of for the last several years is, if you build it, they will come. Let's build this facility and throw lots of power and cooling at it. And then there's place for people to put their cabinets with their IT kit. I think it's, about time that the two different factions, that great divide, disappeared. I've been saying that for years, but I think we're really kind of ripe for the picking for that right now. Don't you?
Oh, I definitely do. And I think one of the biggest shifts we see is when we were designing and building data centers 15, 20 years ago, we envisioned the facility being at capacity, not necessarily at the time we move in, but shortly after. And, we might have had a half a megawatt of IT power, but we sourced 5 megawatts and would have the cooling an electrical environment that we needed already there. And I agree with you where if you look at the rack and start going backwards to determine that, and we're seeing that in design and build now, and specifically what one of the greatest efficiency shifts that we've seen are folks building data centers in areas that allow you to take advantage of what we call free air, 70-80% of the time, or where adiabatic cooling can come into play. But the hyperscalers have definitely done great work in the Nordic area. In the Pacific Northwest in the U.S., we see that as well. And then the other part of that is data centers have become very good about trying to take what was once waste and reuse. So we look at the reclaiming of our heat waste and the ability to heat classrooms. And I think in Denmark, 2015 or 2016, a hyperscaler built a huge facility. They were heating and still are heating an entire neighborhood of businesses and homes with basically free heat. But the important thing is this, that yes, they're getting free heat, but the amount of strain that they've taken from the traditional grid, it's taken massive amount of kilowatt hours and reduction of carbon footprint. And Carrie, you mentioned this a little bit earlier about in states and areas where our capacity to generate is getting very high. In Ohio, most people would not suspect this from Ohio, but we're the third largest coal consuming state in the country. And our power is mostly generated from fossil fuels such as coal and natural gas. So here's where it gets interesting is yes, we want to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're burning. We want to source clean energy. But so many of our communities in the southern and the southwestern part, and even to the border of Indiana, they're coal mining towns. And when the Obama administration was in office, they put in many clean energy acts that stopped the mining of coal. And we saw the families in those towns go bankrupt and had very little means to survive. And then the current administration rolls some of those back, and we can mine coal again, and those families and communities are thriving. But the step Ohio has taken, and it's been an interesting one, our main service provider had a law passed within Ohio's Congress last year. They're actually going to open two pretty large nuclear facilities in the Cleveland area. It's going to be great for Cleveland's economy. The amount of power they're going to be able to generate, and we're not emitting CO2 like we would for coal, and people can argue for and against nuclear. But it was interesting to me that Ohio chose to not necessarily step away from renewable energies, but looked to put their money into nuclear. And it's going to be real interesting to see how that impacts data centers. And will data centers start choosing to build in that area and tap into that large amount of available power? Or will they choose to source renewables or self-generations or microgrids? So it's going to be very interesting to see how those two end up working together.
Well, that is a good point, really, as far as what type and source of energy. When somebody or a company looks to build a data center, if they're not going to occupy home space, within their home office, although to be fair, a lot of companies still do that. And the predictions are that is not going away. Everybody's not going colo. Everybody's not going cloud. There's a whole lot of construction and work happening on company-owned data centers within their own facilities. And a lot of companies are a hybrid. They'll have their own, and then they'll have DR and a colo or something. But the way that space is designed and procured, there's a few hurdles. One, there are some engineers, and we all know it, that have designed the exact same data center for the last 20 years, and the only thing that changes is the footprint of the building. There are some that are amazingly good at figuring out new technologies and understanding, what's new and different out there that could be impactful. And IT doesn't always understand facilities. So IT knows that they need X number of cabinets wherever. And in some companies, that gets turned over to real estate, who may or may not have any clue about anything when it comes to efficiency or where the power is generated from. And I think that's really sort of one piece that's missing in all of this, is that it has to be a conscious effort. It can't just be, oh, by the way, yeah, lucky byproduct, we got by cheaper. I think for companies that really want to be good environmental stewards, it takes bringing in somebody like you or somebody that gets that piece of the equation to make it a conscious effort, because it doesn't happen by mistake.
No, it is definitely a conscious effort, and what I see that it always comes down to is the mindset and the concern that trying to gain efficiency, whether it's how we source or what type of generation we get for our power to the servers, equipment, or even the design, is that I can't have efficiency and maintain my reliability and health of my facility. But what we've learned over the last 8 to 10 years is those two actually go hand in hand. And if you live within our guidelines and standards and recommendations within the industry, and you follow those to have good efficiency or great efficiency in your data center, we see that it actually extends the useful life of equipment. It lowers your total cost of ownership, and that those two actually function and go together hand in hand. And the mindset that you cannot have one without the other, or that if you shoot for efficiency, you're going to lose reliability, is just not true. And I see the industry embracing and understanding that more and more. And it helps us have a comfort level that not only can we, but it's actually responsibility that we should be doing this.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about ASHRAE earlier, which is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And I think a lot of people don't realize is that the recommendations that come out of ASHRAE are with full support of the electronics community. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And there was a project years ago, Christian with Microsoft built a data center in a tent. Well, basically it was a cabinet full of compute, and he let it operate outside in California just to let it run till it was failed. It was a complete experiment. And there was one server that failed, and they sent that server into the manufacturer to ask him why it failed. And apparently a leaf had got sucked up into the fan, and that was what caused the failure. But what they discovered from that is that the equipment operates at much higher temperatures. Well, at higher
Yeah.
temperatures, your air conditioning units also operate better because they have a higher, they're taking in hotter air. And in data centers, you remove heat, you don't add cooling. But so they operate more energy efficiently. And so from there to IEEE, which does the electronic standards, all the way through, there's a cooperation through all of those in the industry. And if you're looking for a career or a job in this industry and you have environmental concerns, any of those are great places to start, right?
Yeah, not only are they a great place to start, they're a great place to offer your services. And I don't know that I can effectively say, hey, that area is wide open, but the need there is very great. And I actually met Christian at DCD London this past fall and had a chance to talk with him a little bit. But you said some things that I try to help people understand all the time. And I will boil down to the hotter your return air, the more efficiently your cooling systems are going to run. The key is you have to keep your hot air away from your supply air. But Mark Monroe made this comment, and we put this in the white paper from the Seattle's Leaders Lab. But he basically said, we know that every switch, every piece of storage, every piece of equipment that's in your data center, that they'll run very effectively up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit at rack inlet temperature. And even though we know and understand that, and we have all of the guidelines, such as ASHRAE, that back us, we still see most folks operating their data center at temperatures well below that. And it's difficult to grasp and understand, hey, we know this, but we're not going to follow that. So I used to joke that ASHRAE is a group that I would love to hang out with on a Friday night. Not really. I thought it would have been the most incredibly boring thing. And then a few years ago, I joined ASHRAE, and the work that they do, it's amazing. And you hit the nail on the head. They're not just, hey, we think this will work, and these are things we support. It's with full cooperation of all of our equipment manufacturers that support that. And we actually see our server and storage and switch manufacturers actually building equipment to say, hey, we want you to operate much better at higher temperatures than you did 10 years ago. We want you to use less power. We want you to require less cooling. And we see those things happening. So from that end, there's great work that's been done, and it's trying to change the mindset and the old patterns of a lot of our data centers to understand that they can push the envelope there and not have concerns about the reliability and health of their equipment.
And honestly, any data center that is trying to, excuse me, improve efficiency and operate a little better, it doesn't take long to have somebody that's been in this industry for a while that understands the IT, the cooling, the power, all of the operations of the data center, to have them come in and do a walkthrough, do an audit. I've done tons of those. Most of the time, I'm sure you'll say the same thing. You can find some low hanging fruit pretty quickly. And, then above and beyond, it's, whatever you want to commit to. And normally, whatever those fixes are, pay for themselves so rapidly just in savings and less complexity. And, there's a million ways to do that. But, bringing in somebody on the outside for 40 hours pays for itself every time. Don't you think?
Oh, it definitely does. And what I'm learning still as I go into data centers is I have the advantage that I managed and still manage a data center, and I would have vendors and contractors make me promises of, you can save money and blah, 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 but it's going to cost you several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you're right. It's my goal when I go into a facility is I have to provide data, not an opinion. I have to be able to measure and calculate and produce analytical data that shows this is where the waste is coming, and more importantly, these are the things you can do that will not cost you money to fix them. And there has not been a data center that I've worked in yet where the amount of money they saved and or a rebate that they've received from their service provider has not covered the cost that they paid for my services at least 5 times over, if not more. And a little amount of money that you invest in that, you're going to pay that one time, but the savings that you will see in your facility, those will come week after week, after month, and year after year. And the part where it gets exciting is being able to extend the useful life of your equipment. You can analytically and data driven show a very large reduction in your total cost of ownership of the facility based on extending the useful life of your mechanical and electrical equipment. And when you can produce and have that data and be able to review it with someone who owns a data center or a CFO or a CIO, that's the language they understand. And no matter how smart you feel you are or how well decorated you are in your area, if it's your opinion, nobody's willing to bank the health of their facility on a person's opinion. But providing accurate analytical data, it becomes much easier for an IT or a financial person to make those decisions and then realize the savings that they will see are very real.
People start in their own job. All of their information typically comes from the vendors that they deal with. And there is no company out there that says, here's more, please do less. It just doesn't work that way these days. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important to understand that there are people that do this that will help you out. You should solicit that advice because you're going to learn things that are outside of your spectrum. All of us that do this kind of work are really happy to transfer knowledge and make sure that you understand findings and the implications and where that's going to go. It helps grow your body of knowledge too, because unfortunately, when times get tough, training typically gets canceled and we rely on our vendors to do transfer of knowledge. While that's absolutely amazing information, it excludes generally most other vendors and a lot of things outside of that space.
Yeah. And one of the points I love to talk with folks about that I think ties this all together. And you and I may have talked about this before, and if we have, I apologize for repeating. But I was born in the '60s, grew up in the '70s, and I was old enough and remember very well the oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war in the '70s. OPEC decided, hey, if you're not for us, you're against us. If you're against us, we're going to make you feel some pain. And they placed an oil embargo specifically on the U.S. And we were running out of gasoline. And in Ohio, we had specific days. I think A through K was Tuesday, Thursday. We could go for gas. I don't know why my father decided in the middle of the summer it would be a good idea to take a young kid with him, but I learned a lot sitting in those lines. I learned that you could take cuss words and make a whole sentence and a whole paragraph out of them.
I'm still pretty good at that one.
Yeah. And I can remember times where we would wait in line for an hour and we would be so close and the gas station would be out of gas. And the mindset that our business models and data centers have now, but I see this changing, is that the more that we can take, the more we'll have at the end of the day. The more power I can have into my facility and have available, the more business I can do, the more money that I'll have. And what we learned in the 70s through not having was this, is that we had to figure out how to do the same type of business, but with half of what our resources were. And we were very good about doing with less. We learned to turn our thermostats down, to ride share, to ride a bicycle, to walk. I remember my father bought a Vespucci moped that he could ride to the hospital that would cost him $2 every 2.5 weeks for gas. And that was like, groundbreaking. That was being efficient. And we're seeing this transfer in data centers specifically related to the environment, being good stewards. And, really, it's not necessarily all our fault how large data centers are and how much power we require. The situation we're in with the coronavirus right now, if you watch the news, the internet traffic is just going crazy. And the need for, hey, kids have to do homeschooling. They have to be able to get online. And we have all this traffic that wasn't there 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we have the expectation is it's going to work. We have to, be able to get on the internet. We have to be able to have our data going to and from data centers to be able to live now. And so that it's not necessarily all our fault, but this is what we're starting to understand within the data centers is the same lesson we learned during the oil embargo of the 70s, that in actuality, the less we take now, at the end of the day, the more our businesses have. And that is a huge shift. Data centers they're putting a great emphasis on being able to compute more with less space, less power, less cooling, less natural resources, and less effect on the environment. So we're really at the early beginning stages of this shift in how we are doing business within our data centers. And it's very important to have avenues like this podcast to be able to continue to create the awareness and provide avenues for education. But we are in a lot of trouble if it doesn't change. And we're so reliant on data in this day and age and the technology and to always be connected that the onus has been put on the data center community to figure out how can you compute double what we are now and use half the amount of power and cooling that we're using. And it's very exciting to be part of that. And it's exciting to see it happening, but it's also, it worries me a lot because of the changes we see within our environment and the fact that some of the people's attitudes are, it's not real, it's not really happening, or I don't care, I'll be dead, or for a long time, I hate the winter so bad in Ohio. My thoughts were great. I'll never have to move out of Ohio. Winters will be really nice. And if it gets too hot in the summer, I'll go to Alaska. It should be, pretty inhabitable Alaska through climate change. But we're in a really precarious time in just with how our global data centers are going to continue to operate and go forward.
Well, it is a really great point. People expect their data to be just like their power. When you turn the switch on, it's got to be there. And certainly, with everybody working at home and homeschooling, people are going to realize that shared bandwidth is a challenge, and making these things happen is a challenge. And certainly looking at the amount of power that's going through data centers right now is pretty crazy. And it used to be that, data and everything that happened in a data center was just a necessary evil to a company. And now it's their life's bread. So, it makes sense to make that as energy efficient and as possible.
I 100% agree with what you said.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end here. Is there anything that we didn't cover, we should have covered, parting words? And for everybody that's listening, I'll make sure that you have a link to Kevin's website. Look him up on LinkedIn. He's all over the place talking about these topics. And if you get a chance, definitely go see him. But is there anything you want to leave us with?
Oh, just I strongly encourage anyone who listens to this to take advantage of the educational resources that are available. And that would be through groups like AFCOM and local chapters and the Data Center World event. And there are other groups that operate similar to that. And to get yourself tied in and take advantage of the resources that are available. And Carrie, you said this a few minutes ago, we're a very giving group of professionals, and we want to help others learn. We want to learn from others, and just get yourself tied in and take full advantage of everything you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for those of you that don't know, AFCOM got postponed to the fall. So that is a great place to learn about all of this. You'll see some of the technology live there, but Kevin's got a session. I've got one actually on the software defined power that we talked about earlier, and another one on better ways to procure that will cover some of these same topics too from a procurement standpoint. So we encourage you guys to show up to AFCOM, get involved in your local chapter. If you need somebody to speak locally, if you want to set up a webcast, we're both happy to do those as well. Kevin, I want to thank you for your time this morning. You've actually put out some wonderful information there. I'll see you soon. For the rest of you, we look forward to you listening on the next edition of our podcast series.
All right. Thanks, Carrie. I appreciate the opportunity.